Guys, we're doing another pair of stays, but these ones are my ultimate beginner pattern. My whole goal with this pattern was to make a stays pattern that an absolute beginner can sew. So if you haven't sewn a lot, or if you're just getting into sewing and you're like, I really would just want to do this to make a pair of stays, I say go for it. You just have to have the audacity to try and the perseverance to not give up, and you will be able to make a pair of stays, I promise. They're not as hard as they look. There are some fiddly parts, for sure. This is a pattern that's designed to be easy to fit and easy to sew and easy to wear. I just released the And Stays pattern on my Etsy, so this tutorial is designed to go with them, but you can always just take the tips, tricks, and techniques that I use in this and apply them to pretty much any pair of stays. This is based off extremely early examples, kind of think Tudor England. They're quite up and down in shape. They don't have the extreme conical shape, so they are much easier to fit. You don't have to worry about doing a whole heap of mock-ups and getting the fit just right, worrying about pinching your hips or putting pressure on your waist or your back or anything like that, because these ones aren't designed to kind of create this shape so much as they are to just give the bust a little bit of support and lift. And that's about all. They actually should end above your natural waist, so you don't have that issue of the stays kind of sitting on your hips and putting a whole load of pressure right there, which is something that I know when you're fitting stays can be quite a difficult fit issue to troubleshoot. So these ones just kind of negate that. I designed this pattern because when I've spoken to a lot of people, when I'm selling at markets or online, people sending me DMs, one of the most common things people tell me is that they really struggle with doing the bias binding around the edge. It's quite difficult, and I've heard other people say it was kind of like the hurdle that made them sort of push the whole project to the side. So I wanted to make a pattern where the binding was optional. So I've got two versions of this. One is bound on the edges with bias tape in sort of the usual way you see stays constructed. And then the other pair, which is bag lined. So these actually allow you to just skip the whole binding part completely and just make a pair of stays without it. They are set up with cross lacing in the back, even though I know anyone who is interested in stays and historical undergarments, I get comments like this that they would have been spiral laced, which is true. But if you're like me and you're alone a lot when you get dressed, especially if you're alone when you're making the pair of stays and you need to put them on to fit them, or you just finish them, spiral lacing in the back by yourself is nigh on impossible. So I've made these ones set up to be cross-laced. Only thing I don't cover is eyelets, just because a lot of the time brands that make eyelets have their own instructions that come with it, and even if they look the same, sometimes they're made differently. So I don't want to give you instructions that are going to ruin your pair of eyelets. Also, I apologize in advance. I had some technical issues shooting this, so the ISO on my camera was a little bit squidgy. So there are some shots that look a little bit blown out. I'm really sorry. I've done my best to fix it in post, but if you notice some odd lighting, that's why. Alright guys, we're going to start first of all with a print at home pattern. So if any of the steps in this process you know already, just skip them. So the first thing we're looking at is page 1 of the actual pattern, and it's got two really important pieces of information on it. The first is the scale. So when you print out your pattern, set everything up as you will and print just the first page, just so you can check the scale against a ruler and check that centimeters or inches, whatever you prefer, is the right scale. It actually measures 10 centimeters or 4 inches. And then the other thing you need to check is that little graph just shows you how the pattern is going to look when it's fully constructed. So you know kind of how many pieces go together and what you're aiming for in the end. And then you just start cutting them out. I cut all my right edges off and all my bottom edges off and leave the rest so I have something for the sticky tape to kind of grab onto. It's just a little bit easier that way. I pre-do all my pages, so all my bottom edges, all my right edges are cut off, and then I just start sticking them together in order according to that little graph. So page 1 and 2, you can see there's little diamond markers in the middle of every page just to show how they go together. So aligning the top edge, aligning our diamond marker, and then aligning the bottom edge. I would actually recommend you use masking tape, because you can pull masking tape off and on really easily without damaging the paper, but I'm just going to use clear sellotape so you can see through to the pattern and what I'm doing. So I will just start by going through, and at every little diamond marker, I will put a little bit of tape. Or if you can see here, you only really need to tape together the pieces of the pattern that are pattern pieces. So I'll go through, and just to save on tape, I will use that tape only to stick together where the pattern pieces are, just because I know in the long run that's going to save me time and tape. So once my first row is done, you can see that's 4 pages across. That's the same as on the side where my little graph is. Some of the sizes are different. Some of them are 5 pages across. So just make sure you check the graph that comes on your pattern piece. And then you just keep going. Row by row, I like to go first row all together, second row all together, and then as I'm going, stick the tops to the bottoms like you can see now. So I'm sticking 1, 2, 3, 4 to 5, 6, 7, 8. And that just helps, if anything's becoming misaligned or there's something that hasn't been stuck together quite right, it just helps combat kind of cumulative error as you're going across. If you can kind of see, okay, yep, everything's fitting together as I go. And it's just a matter of keeping on going. It's a bit of a tedious process if you've never done one of these before. Even if you have, it is something that just takes a little bit of time. You just gotta, put a show on, put a movie on, put your favorite album on, and just kind of keep on going until your pattern is all together. And once it's done, you have a big giant piece of paper that looks like this. Again, I haven't stuck everything together, so you can see the blank bits in between my pattern are not stuck together. I'll rough cut out, and then I just go around the edges of all my pattern pieces. The way these are set up is you get both views of the pattern for every size in a file. So you can see here I'm cutting out my size, and I have view A and view B. And the only difference between these two views is that one of them has seam allowance around all the edges, and the other one only has seam allowance on some edges. So you can see that difference here in the comparison. So the last thing I want to do to prepare these pattern pieces is I just like to pre-poke the holes in my pattern so that I can mark everything on my pieces all at one go. You can use an awl, which is that first tool there, but if you don't have an awl, just use a pencil or a pen or a knitting needle, anything you have that's pointy and sharp that's going to make a little hole. And these are set up with a little cross so you can see exactly where the center of that eyelet should be. Align the point of whatever tool you're using, and you only need to make a very small hole, just enough for the tip of a pencil to fit through. So when you're marking your eyelets for the future, you can see where they should be. I just show you with each tool here, because if you don't have specialty sewing tools, if you're just getting into it, use what you can find. When I started sewing, I had next to nothing, and I was using, random things from the kitchen and around the house. You don't need a fancy awl. You can do this with whatever you've got at home. So once that's all done, my pattern pieces are all prepped, and then it's time to start working on the fabric. So I would recommend pre-washing and ironing your fabric as flat as you can get it before starting, to account for any stretch, shrinkage, color running, anything like that might happen with this fabric. I'm using a cotton herringbone, which feels like kind of a mid-weight denim with no stretch. You want a fabric that's nice and sturdy and has no stretch in it. And then we're just gonna lay out the pattern pieces. If you are not making a tutorial, you will probably only make one view of this. There is a guide included in the pattern instructions to how you can lay these out best on your fabric. So for me, I'm using 2 layers of this cotton herringbone as my strength and my outer layer. You can use 2 of the same fabric, or if you want a reversible pair of stays, or you want a prettier fabric on the outside that's not quite as strong, you can use different fabric, which is why in the pattern instructions I have it listed as outer fabric and strength fabric. You still want your outer fabric to be quite sturdy, because it will still take strain from the boning. The last thing we're going to do is cut out our bias tape. This comes with the pattern. It's a separate piece. You can use this. It doesn't have to just be for this pair of stays. I use this bias guide for cutting out any bias I need. There's a little triangle there, which we want to cut off. I cut off the excess and then cut this into strips, because this becomes one really long strip that we can stretch across the length of the fabric. That's going to act as a guide on getting that perfect 45-degree angle. So that's what that little cutoff on the side there is. It's a 45-degree angle. So if you align that with the edge of your fabric and the other end of the bias tape, which has the same cut on it, with the other end of your fabric, you should get a lovely perfect 45 degrees. So I leave a little bit of paper just on the edge of every second piece of mine, and that is how I'm sticking them together here. And you just stick all these pieces along together. This will fit perfectly across a standard 140 centimeter width fabric. I think that's 55 inch, so like the kind of standard most places fabric width. Then here, like I said, we just align it with one edge, pin it in place, and then that's that 45 degrees. So that's making that piece of paper, our guide, shoot off at a 45-degree angle, which is perfect bias is 45 degrees to the grain of the fabric. And then you just want to cut out along that edge like any other piece of fabric. For this pair of stays, I would recommend cutting 2 to 3 of these lengths. So for probably the first 2 sizes, if you're up to a medium, you're only going to need 2 of these lengths. Above that, I would recommend cutting 3. Just so you have that width there. It's really frustrating to have to go back and cut it out again. So that is everything we need for view A. You only need the bias tape if you're doing view A. If you're doing view B, you can see they're slightly wider pattern piece, but you need to duplicate these pieces again for lining. And I'm just using a really basic cotton calico. Any sort of quilting weight cotton will work for the lining. You don't want anything too lightweight. Something a little bit sturdy, but it doesn't have to be as heavy duty as the strength fabric. The next thing we're going to do with stays and corsets, there's a lot of prep work before you get into the sewing, is I like to go through and mark all my boning channels while my pieces are flat. And I do this for view A and for view B. So the way I do it is I align the one edge, shift the piece up, and just where at the bottom of every little one of those boning channels, I just put a little mark with my pencil. So you can see there along the top, those 5 little marks, and then we have corresponding ones at the bottom and one on the side seam too. And then all we have to do is grab a ruler and we connect these dots. I like to start at the back edge or at one side and work my way across, just so that I make sure I'm not accidentally going diagonal, connecting 2 dots together that shouldn't be. But once that's done, that is all prepped and ready to go, so that when you're sewing your boning channels in a little bit later, it's already marked. You don't have to try and contend with fabric that's sewn into a shape, which will be much harder to do. And remember, you have to make a mirror of the back pieces for this pattern. So what I do, I'm lucky my printing paper is quite see-through, so I can see through, and I just make those little notches on the back, because that's really all you need, is just the beginning and end. But if you can't see through your printer paper, hold it up to a window, or put it on your phone screen just so you can see through, and transfer the ends of those boning channels so that you can draw them onto your mirror piece. And connecting them by ruler again. So once you've done your 2 back pieces, they should be mirrored, and you only need to mark the boning channels on one side. So for me, I ended up marking them on the outside, but you can mark them on the lining. You can mark them wherever suits you, whatever is easiest for you to see. Just make sure it's on the right side of the fabric, because for this view of the stays, we do need to be able to see it once the stays are sewn together. And then with the front piece, just like with the back piece, shifting it down, shifting it up slightly, just so you can mark those little end pieces, so you can join the dots and your pattern is all marked and ready. And again, that's for view A and view B. It's just so much easier if you get these pieces prepped now while they're flat. Let's start with view A. So this is the bias bound pair of stays. And the first thing we need to do is connect our side seams and our shoulder seams. So we'll start with one side. You can see those armhole continues, so we know we're putting them together right. Just pinning up along the side seam and then pinning our shoulder seam together, right sides together. So we're going to take that to the machine and we're going to sew it at 1 centimeter seam allowance. This whole pattern is made with 1 centimeter seam allowance for absolutely everything. So that for me, that happens to just be the edge of my foot. Removing pins as you go, sewing down that first side edge and then the shoulder seam as well. And then take it to the ironing board. I'm so sorry, don't look at how dirty my ironing board cover is. I promise it's just steam staining. And pressing those seams flat and open. It is a lot easier to press seams open as you go instead of trying to come back and press them at the end. And it just means that you don't end up with a whole bunch of ironing to do at the end of, every 10 steps or so. So once again, aligning, you can see that curve continue so we know it's in the right place. Pinning together the side seams and pinning together the shoulder pieces. Now the angle on the shoulder piece can feel a little bit weird, but just shift them over and don't worry, once it's on the body, this will all start making sense. So once again, taking that to the machine, 1 centimeter seam allowance, sewing from top to bottom and sewing the shoulder closed as well. And then we have a whole finished piece. And for view A, we actually want to repeat this exact process with our second layer of strength fabric. So I have this one here. This is the one without the boning channels marked, and our 2 side pieces. And in exactly the same way, we're going to take them to the machine, sew all those seams closed, and press them open. So we have 2 duplicate pieces. You can see here my top layer is the one with the boning channels marked on it, and we want to align these 2 pieces right sides together. So my boning channel markings are going on the inside for now. It's important to see that you're aligning these pieces correctly. So I like to check my side seams and make sure those are matching up on both sides, as well as the corners for the top neckline. Those will become really obvious when you're looking at them in person, whether those are misaligned. But then you just want to pin these 2 center back seams. So these are the 2 outermost seams. We want to pin those closed because we're going to sew them together to form up our back seams. Right sides together for both of these pieces. So again, to the sewing machine, and we're sewing these at 1 centimeter of seam allowance, straight down the back. Once those are done, you can see I've kind of made a really big loop out of this fabric. And before we turn it right side out, we're just going to kind of fold it out so we get easier access to those back seams, because we want to press these to the side and understitch them. So my boning channels, I've decided I'm marking them on the outside. So I just put a pin in that. If you're like me and you're working with 2 fabrics that are 2 layers of the same fabric, or you can't differentiate them from the wrong side, I like to put a pin to mark which one's my front side, because we are going to press the seam allowance away from the front side. We want to press the seam allowance towards the lining. So over at the ironing board, I'm using a little sleeve ham just for ease. We want to press these towards the lining and then stitch them down right next to the seam allowance we already sewed. So you can see it's only a little bit off that seam allowance. You can see a little easier here. I just align where I've already sewn to the middle of my foot, and sew straight down on top of that seam allowance, sewing it to the lining side of the stays. That just helps for this to roll under. You'll see here, even before I've pressed it, it wants to make the lining roll to the inside. So this just stops that kind of peeking out at that back edge, and then you just want to press it to hold it completely in place. And you will get a beautifully flat, smooth seam here, where your lining isn't kind of rolling to the front and annoying you and peeking out from the inside of your stays. And it's starting to look like a pair of stays already, guys. So that's what the stay stitching looks like from the inside. And the next thing we're going to do is start prepping it for boning. So I like to secure my neckline to stop the sleeves wiggling around, to stop the pieces becoming misaligned. So starting at the back edge, pinning up and over one of the straps, along the front neckline and around the other strap, or in one kind of long continuous line you can see there, up and around, over the front, up and around the other sleeve, and all the way to the neckline. This we want to stitch at 3 millimeters. So whatever the kind of closest marking on your foot is to where your needle comes down, that's probably going to be about 3 millimeters. So you can see there, it's aligned to that little, tiny little inside marking on my foot, stitching along the back edge, lifting the foot and pivoting, twisting the garment around so that now we're going up the sleeve. And you just want to keep sewing this all the way around this edge. These secures these edges together. It stops the boning coming out the top when we put the boning in and gets it all prepped for doing the bias tape later. So we're not trying to hold two edges of fabric together and put bias tape on all at once. And then that's it all sewn. So you can see that's kind of one continuous edge all the way around that top edge. And I recommend doing this on the armholes now as well, just to get it out of the way and prep it for the bias tape that's going to come later on. So taking that to the machine and stitching it at 3 millimeters seam allowance, just the same as the other one. And this is the time when I'll go around and trim off any seam allowance that's sticking out. And it is inevitable that things will get a little bit misaligned, human error, cutting error, things like that. If it's just a little bit misaligned, don't worry about it. Just go along and trim off any excess that's kind of sticking out over the seam allowance. The next thing we're going to do is boning. We're speeding right along. My best advice for putting in boning is pick one side. So for me, I always start at the right and I always stitch from top to bottom. So you stitch your rightmost channel and then your next rightmost channel, moving along all the way along the garment from right all the way until the left, always starting at the top and moving towards the bottom. So we'll go to the machine and we'll do that now. You can see I'm at the top of the seam allowance, at the top of the stays, and just stitching along the lines we marked earlier from top to bottom all the way along. This can get a little tricky as you get towards the leftmost side of the stays, but I find just kind of rolling that right edge out of the way, it works a treat, and it stops puckering or the fabric shifting in multiple ways. So once that's done, I just trim off all my excess threads and then we're ready to start boning. So I'm just using a roll of plastic boning. I have a lot of this because I make these for markets, but you can use those big industrial zip ties. You can buy smaller rolls of boning. You can buy pre-cut boning, whatever works for you. What I like to do is align the boning to the boning channel, shift it up so that I've got a 3 centimeter gap at the bottom, and then cut my boning. So what you'll see here is those 3 back channels are all the same height and length. So this one length of boning should work for all of them. And because the stays are mirrored, it will work on the other side as well. So I'm going to cut 6 of these, including my first one, so 5 more. And all of these will be about 3 centimeters shorter than the actual boning channel is. And that's to allow for a little bit of movement and for the width of the bias tape, because you don't want that boning pressing against the bias tape and putting pressure on the fabric. The last thing we want to do before we insert them is just sand off those corners, just so that it doesn't have to be crazy, just a little bit rounded so you can't feel any points when you rub your finger over the top. And then just inserting them between the 2 layers of fabric along all 6 of those channels. So 3 on the left and 3 on the right. And then we can move on to our next channels. So once again, aligning it, shifting it up 3 centimeters, marking and cutting. And then checking before we cut any duplicates that it's going to fit in all of those boning channels. There's 2 on each side that are the same length, so I cut 4 of these total, sand them, and then insert them in between the layers. Then we can move on to our front channels. So these ones are all in pairs because it's symmetrical. So once again, measuring, trimming, sanding and inserting. I like to do this one at a time because otherwise I will get confused about which boning channel. Some of them look really, really similar in length, and I just find this less aggravating than trying to do them all at once and then figure out which boning piece went in which channel. And if you're like me, you'll find that your stays are now very, very curly. All you have to really do is hit it with the iron on a good hot heat with a lot of steam and press it flat. You can use a heavy book to kind of help weigh it down, but a couple goes of this and they will look lovely and flat again. So you can see it's pressed most of the curve out of that. I like to check these now that my back are the same length before I attach my bias, because you don't want to attach your bias and then find out your back two pieces have become misaligned in some way. The other thing we're going to tackle now is bias tape. So the instinct is to pin it on, but because bias tape has a lot of natural stretch, even though this fabric isn't stretchy, cutting it on the bias gives it this stretch. It's so much easier to actually just sew this at the machine because you can pull and stretch and move the bias tape as you need to. So starting a little bit below where that kind of 45-degree cut is, because we need enough overhang that we can tuck this under so we don't have any raw edges, and aligning it at 6 millimeters from the edge, back tacking, and then starting along the stays. It's easy at first because that back edge is straight, but you can see here as we get to the corners, we need to lift the foot and kind of pull on the bias tape a little bit to help it get around these curves and corners. This is a lot more intuitive than it looks like it's going to be. But you just lift up the foot and kind of, you'll feel it. Just pull and tug. When you're going on a curve that sticks out like this, it's actually easier to pull up on the inside like you can see me doing here, moving that excess out of the way, and then just slowly going back around the curves, lifting the foot, pivoting the garment whenever you need to. And in that way, just keep making your way around the entire bottom edge. Lifting, pivoting, stretching and pulling. You don't want to stretch too much on the bias tape, but you can see here, I give it quite a good stretch to get around some of these curves. Like just here, you can see where I've pulled on it a little bit, and that just gets it around that curved edge and keeps it nice and taut and tight on the garment. And you just keep on going that way, lifting, pivoting, pulling, and keep on sewing. Back tacking at the end, and then when we're done, we're all ready. I like to not pre-fold my bias tape. I find it easier to fold the bias tape when I'm done. So we're cutting off that excess and I start pushing it under from the front. So you can see there how it's kind of going to look when we're done. Flipping it over. And then from the back side, I like to work along the straight edges first. So folding it up once to touch the bottom of the stays and then folding it over twice. And that should cover the previous line of stitching that's attaching the bias tape to the garment. Folding it up once, folding it up twice, and pinning it in place. It's easiest to do this along the straight edges first. So that flat bottom edge, the back edge, folding once, folding twice, pinning in place. And then this edge here is quite straight, so I'll go there next, folding once, folding twice, pinning in place. And then those two little curves sort of figure themselves out. You don't really have to, the stretch of the bias tape will make that easier than it feels like it's going to be. And you almost don't even need to fold them there. You just need to kind of scooch them over with your thumb and pin it in place, because that bias tape will want to sit in that curve. And then we'll do the same on the other side. So starting at the flat edges, folding once, folding twice, pinning in place. Folding once, folding twice, pinning in place. Moving on to that last flat edge there, folding it twice, pinning it in place. And then once again, the curves kind of sort themselves out. Because the bias tape is stretched to go around them, it wants to go flat again. And it will naturally sit into the curves. So the next thing we have to do is deal with the edges. So unpinning that, you can see here, folding it over. I like to pop a pin in here just to help me hold it in place. And then we're doing the same movement, folding it up once, folding it up twice, and pinning it in place. We can move that holding pin. It's easier to do this at the end when the rest of the fabric is already held in place, because the bias tape will want to sit in the same way as the bias tape next to it. You'll feel this when you're folding it, this effect of having the rest pinned first and just taking care of those little back edges last. Pinning everything in place, and then we're done. The last thing we have to do, because we're gonna understitch, we're gonna stitch in the ditch is those pins are currently sitting on the back of the garment. So what we wanna do is move them to the front. So pulling them out of the back one at a time, starting at the straight edges again, and we're gonna pin into the little ditch where that seam is, where the bias tape is attached. You'll see it when you're doing it in person. It's right along that stitch edge at the edge of the bias tape. So you can see now the pins are all sitting along the front edge. We're gonna take that to the machine and aligning that edge right there, the edge of the bias tape where it's sewn. I like to pull a pin out just enough that I can get my needle down, and I'll lower this manually because it can be quite thick, and I want to check my needles coming down in just the right place. Back tacking and then stitching along this edge. If you are using matching thread, this will be a lot easier and almost completely invisible when you're done. I'm just using black thread on white so you guys can see what I'm doing really, really clearly. But you just follow that whole edge around, lifting the foot, pivoting whenever you need to, and then you'll see that bias tape from the front there almost completely invisibly attached. And from the back, it's just held in place by one smooth line of stitching. Once that's done, I shuffle all my bones down to the bottom because the last thing we want is getting a bone under the foot. And then we're going to put the bias tape around the top edge of the stays. So here's my second piece of bias tape. Once again, leaving overhang, going to the machine, and we're stitching this 6 millimeters from the edge. This is nearly all straight lines. It's just 4 corners. So we've got this back corner. We want to keep stitching, lift when we get to 6 millimeters from the edge of the sleeve. So we're going in quite a way. You can mark this with pencil, and then you want to twist your bias tape around. Now this can be fiddly. I use a pin to help me pivot and straighten that bias tape up so it's aligned with the sleeve. Now you don't need to worry about what that bias tape is doing except for right in front of the needle, because the rest will sort itself out once you're done. So you can see I'm going nice and slow, taking easy slow stitches, and then we can continue along the sleeve until we get to the next corner. So once again, 6 millimeters away from that next edge, lift, pivot, and then twisting the bias tape around, using a pin to move the excess out of the way, lowering that foot, taking a couple slow stitches, and then we can go along at full speed again. Lifting, pivoting, twisting that fabric. You can see here, I've actually not gone far enough. So I pivot back, take one more stitch, and then check again. And now I can see, yep, I'm aligned at that mark on my foot, that's 6 millimeters. And then I'm going to use a pin to help me move that bias tape around out of the way, and we can keep stitching along the next sleeve. One final corner at the back, stitch all the way along, back tack, and then we're done that top edge. So we can snip off our excess, start flipping the bias tape up, and then we are going to do the same exact process that we did on the bottom to the top. So here you can see my bias tape there. I'm going to start with the straight edges, so folding once, folding twice, and pinning in place. Folding once, folding twice, and pinning in place. Again, don't worry about the corners. Do all your straight, flat edges first, and the corners will kind of sort themselves out. The sleeves are actually straight. They're just sewn into a loop. But once you get them flat on the table, you'll feel that they are quite straight. Those edges are easy to fold. So I'm coming all the way down. You can see that corner there. The only thing I like to do is kind of wiggle the fabric around until I get one nice fold. You can see that there. And then from the back, you can kind of stretch and pull and shuffle this with your fingers until it covers that line of stitching and pinning it in place. And we're doing that all the way along the top edge. So folding twice, pinning in place, just doing the sleeves and the flat back and front edges, and then leaving the corners until last, because once all those other bits are done, those corners kind of sort themselves out. As you can see there, that fabric is already nearly sitting in the perfect place. We just need to pop a pin in it. And then for the two back edges, using the same technique as with the bottom, folding in and then folding down. And then just as we did with the bottom edge, we're going to transfer the pins to the front so that we can stitch in the ditch from the top side. So we know that the outside of our stays is going to be the neatest spot. So that's the underside. You can see all of the bias tape is caught, and from the outside, the pins are sitting right in that ditch. And once again, taking it to the machine, stitching nice and slow, going around, pivoting at the corners. At the corners, you might need to pivot twice just because of the width of the bias tape. And then keep on sewing right in that ditch, right at the edge of that bias tape, all the way around to the corners. Lift the foot, pivot, and then keep on sewing. Here on this corner, you can see I definitely needed to take 2 stitches, pivot, 2 stitches, pivot, and then I could go in a straight line. So as long as you're following the edge of where that bias tape sits, it doesn't matter how many times you have to kind of pivot on a curve or pivot around the corners. Just keep your stitches tight to the edge. Everything else will sort itself out. And then we're nearly done. We just have to do our armholes. So I'm using my 2 offcuts. The only difference here, I will pin the beginning in place because I fold the edge back, because our under edge is going to become the top edge once everything's folded up and over the seam allowance in place. So I have 1 pin, I have that edge folded and aligned to my side seam, but then I will follow around the edge in the normal way as we did before, just pulling on that bias tape to get it around any curves. At the end, when we get back to the beginning, overlapping just enough. You can see there it's overlapping about the length of that fold. And then you can cut off any excess. That piece is so small now, I know I'm not going to be able to use it, so I toss it to the side, and then there you can see when we fold it up, we have a lovely finished edge on the bias tape as well. And just like before, pushing it out, folding it once, folding it twice, pinning it in place. I start with my beginning piece. If I have a lot of overlap, I'll just trim off a little bit at the edge to stop with the bulk, and then folding that other edge on top, pinning them both in place. So you can see there, that's that lovely smooth edge, and then following around the armhole, folding twice and pinning in place. And then we're done. We just have to shift those pins once again to the outside so we can stitch in the ditch. Checking the bias tape is caught so that we know when we stitch it, we're going to catch it, and then taking it to the machine and stitching right along the edge of the bias tape. Removing the pins as we go. And we're pretty much done. All we need to do is eyelets, guys. So we pre-marked those holes so we can transfer those onto the pattern, the garment now, through the little holes we pre-marked. So I'll just go through with a pencil, and in every middle hole there, just making a tiny little dot so I know where to poke a hole to put my eyelets in. Like I said, I'm not going to show you how to put eyelets into this one, just because eyelets normally come with their own instructions. But that is the final step. So once that's done, there are lots of eyelet kits like this you can get at Spotlight or Joann's, RIP Joanne. And these will have the instructions on the back for how to use them and how to insert them. The only thing I will recommend is if you don't have a die cut, which is something that cuts fabric, using something like an awl and then a knitting needle to get that hole in the fabric so you can fit the eyelet through has been an absolute lifesaver for me before I could afford to get die cuts. And then once the eyelets are inserted, your stays look like this and they are ready to go. You just need to lace them, but we will do lacing together at the end. Let's move on to view B. So this is our bag line pair of stays. So once again, we have two of our strength layer, or an outer and a strength layer. But unlike with view A, we are going to put the boning channels into these while they are flat. So taking them over to the ironing board, ironing these pieces together, it helps create a little bit of a temporary fuse between the fabrics. It will help them lie completely flat so we don't get any bubbles. And while we're still at the ironing board, popping some pins into these just so that while we're sewing boning channels, these fabric pieces aren't going swiggly wiggly every which way. Once they are pinned together, I do front and then both back pieces, remembering you need mirror back pieces, so a right and a left. Then they are ready to be sewn for boning channels. So just like with view A, same rules apply for boning. You want to pick a side. So for me, it's always right, and I always sew top to bottom. You don't have to go right to left and top to bottom. You could go bottom to top, you could go left to right, whatever's more comfortable. But once you pick one, do it across all the pieces. So both backs and the front piece. Right to left, top to bottom, or whichever way you pick, but just keep it consistent across all of them. So again, right over to left, top down to bottom, or left to right and bottom to top, whichever one. Just make sure whatever one you pick, it's the same for every single boning channel. You're not flipping it upside down at any point, because that's what can make the fabric get pulls and puckers and tucks. So here you can see I'm showing you again on the first one, starting over at the side, doing that first boning channel, and then we're moving immediately across to the next one. So it's rightmost boning channel, and then next rightmost boning channel, and then the next rightmost boning channel, all the way across until all the boning channels are sewn. And then when you're done, you have all your pieces already prepped with boning channels and ready to go. So once again, if you have any little bits where the fabric has become misaligned, human error, a little bit of cutting error, just snip those down now so you're not trying to reconcile which one's the real seam allowance at the end. And then we're ready to attach our back pieces. So we're going to attach them along the side seams. So let's start with one, flipping it over, right sides together. Now this one we have to be quite precise. So I like to pop a pin in through the stitching line of the top one, and then in through the stitching line of the next one, so that I know that when I sew along this line, I'm not going to accidentally sew my boning channel closed on either of these pieces. So I want the pin to be coming out of the stitching, and then I put it back in the stitching on that side and make sure it's coming out the stitching on the top side. Hopefully you can see that nice and clear on the screen. So pinning through the stitching line and then pinning back through the stitching line on the other side. I'll do 3 pins. That's about the length I need, but do as many or as few as you feel you need to keep those pieces nice and squarely aligned to each other. Then we take this to the sewing machine and aligning the needle to that line of stitching that we've already sewn, back tacking, and we're going to sew right along top of that seam that's already there once again, and that's going to become our side seam. So removing pins as we go, sewing in a straight line right on top of that stitching line, all the way to the end, back tacking at the end, back tacking at all the ends. And then that becomes our side seam. So you can see I'm just pressing open with my fingers for now. And that's what it looks like from the front. So you don't have any extra lines of stitching there. And because we're going to bag line this one, we don't need to worry about that bit of seam being finished because we're going to cover it with a lining. So then we're going to repeat the process on the other side. So making sure I've got right sides together because my fabric looks exactly the same from both sides, flipping it over, aligning them, and pinning into that seam that's already been sewn there. That way I can sew right on top of it, and I know I'm not going to accidentally sew my boning channel narrower or sew it closed. And now we've got both sides attached. I like to go through, press it with my hands, check I haven't accidentally taken any stitches where I didn't mean to really quickly, and then when I know that it's sewn correctly, I'll take it over to the ironing board and I will press both of those seams open. And now we're done. So I have my seam allowances there. Now it is time to insert the boning now that we've got all of this done. So just like with the front, I'm using a roll of boning, but you can use any boning alternative that you like. And measuring 3 centimeters shorter than the boning channel looks, cutting, sanding off any kind of corners or rough edges, and then inserting into the boning channels. I do a bit of a more in-depth explanation of this in view A. So if you want to go watch that, just jump back to the right chapter in the video. But just inserting in every one. And the most important thing is making sure the boning is 3 centimeters shorter than the channel is. Now we're ready to do our lining. So we're gonna construct this in the same way, but we don't have to do any of the boning channels. So we're going to attach at the side seams. And again, this is a little less tricky and fiddly because we don't have to deal with any of those boning channels we've sewn in. So just pinning and then taking it to the machine and stitching along those side seams at 1 centimeter of seam allowance. And then pressing these open. And once again, making sure you don't have your shoulder seams sewn closed. We need those open so that we can flip this through later. So now right sides together, I'm aligning my outer with my boning channels with my lining. And you can see here, it kind of looks like my outer has shrunk a little bit. And that's because the width of the boning actually kind of draws that layer in a little bit. So it will look shorter, but we can gently tug these together. So aligning at the side seams, shifting those, pinning them together, and then just sort of gently shimmy the fabric with your fingers as you go. You might need to tug a little bit gently on that outer layer of fabric, and these pieces will mostly realign again. So even at the top, aligning at the side seams, and then making sure any of the kind of the straps, the curves, that those all align. Pinning around all those edges, pinning along the front, aligning at the side seams. You might need to, again, shimmy, give it a little bit of a tug, be gentle. We don't want to stretch the fabric, but you'll feel as you kind of work it with your fingers, you can mostly realign these panels. And you can see there that excess has been worked in. So now what we're going to do at the machine is we're going to stitch along the top and the bottom edges, but we're not going to stitch our shoulder seams closed. So you can see there, yep, that top, very top edge, we're not going to stitch. And we're going to leave our back edges open as well, because this is how we pull it through later to flip it right side out. So taking that over to the machine, starting at my top back edge, stitching along to my corner, lifting the foot, pivoting, and stitching up the length of the strap until we get to the end where the shoulder is. Back stitching, and then not pivoting, we're just going to move and do the other edge of the strap, leaving that shoulder seam open. That is so we can attach these pieces later. You should actually stop stitching. I had to unpick mine a little bit because I made a bit of a mistake. You should stop stitching seam allowance, so 1 centimeter from the edge of the shoulder. And that's so we can fold those edges back out of the way when we're closing the shoulder seams later. So stitching down the straps, pivoting, stitching along the front, pivoting here, stitching up the other strap, and doing that, we've done all the way along the bottom. We've done our back edges, skipped our shoulders, done our armholes, skipped our shoulders, and then done our front neckline and left our back seams open. So next step before we can turn it through is just to clip all of our corners. So we want to clip as close to the seam allowance as you can without cutting any of those stitches. And this just allows the fabric to turn nicely. If we don't do this, you'll find you get a whole lot of puckers. The fabric won't want to flip through to the right side. So you want to, anywhere there's a curve, just these little cuts in the fabric, and anywhere there's a corner. So all the way around my arm size, into the corners, and along that bottom edge at the front where it's got that really deep curve, clipping out those corners, clipping out little triangles so that the bulk of that fabric is alleviated as well. So you can see the triangles, you can see the little snips on the sides, on both sides. And you can see that allows me to pull and stretch the fabric way easier. So clipping the corners, clipping the curves under the armhole, clipping the back corners, and same on the other side. So all my little clips in there, and then we can turn it through to the front. So I reach my arm all the way through just to kind of get the fabric loose and ready to turn. But I find the easiest way is to kind of roll back one edge and just slowly feed it through. This can feel really awkward because the boning's in there. The hardest part is the little flap at the front where the stomacher is. I like to just roll that up, tuck it under into the bit I've already turned, and then the hardest part is done. You just keep rolling it on through and kind of go through, pull it out, push a little bit in. It's a bit awkward, but it's not very hard to do. And it will want to spring back to flat because of the boning in it as well. So there you go. And then those edges are finished without any binding. I'll use a knitting needle just to help me get the straps through because they're a little bit long and skinny, but I use the blunt edge so I don't accidentally poke any holes in my fabric. And I can just use that to kind of shimmy the fabric up the length of the sleeve. I can also just use my fingers if you don't have a knitting needle to kind of slowly shimmy it out, pull it all the way to the front. And we do that on both sides and your stays are nearly done. So everything is finished and you've got a lining on the inside. We now just want to take this to the ironing board and iron it flat. This will help keep the boning flat if you've used curved boning like me, but it will also help the lining lay flat. And you can see those looking really beautiful now. Now we can attach our shoulder straps. So just pinning the outer fabric, trying not to catch the lining. I'm just pinning through my outer fabric. You can see here that I realize I've made a mistake sewing all the way to the edge. And I go and I unpick that before I take it to the machine. So I can fold my lining out of the way on both sides and sew right sides together. My outer fabric's 1 centimeter away from the edge. And then I'm going to take it to the ironing board and press that seam open. And there you can see I'm just starting to fold my outer under my lining layers. So I kind of fold them out. I'll tuck one lining layer under the other. You can see my messy stitches from where I had to unpick, but that's okay, I fix them later. And then tucking just a little bit of the edge of the lining under, and then all my shoulder seams are covered. And pinning that in place. Now this seam you could machine sew if you wanted to, but I am going to hand sew it. I think that looks very neat. So that's what I'm going to do. So I sink the edge of my thread I just leave a little tail in the fabric. I take one stitch going the other way so I don't accidentally pull it through. One more stitch. This I leave a little loop so I can tie a knot by passing my needle through it, and then we can start stitching. So I'm going to do a whip stitch. So that is where you catch one side of the fabric and then go diagonally across to the other and back the way you came. So hopefully it sounds a little awkward, but hopefully you can see what I mean. Stitching into one side, twisting the needle, stitching into the other, and pushing and pulling that thread all the way through. So it's a little diagonal stitch catching both sides of the lining all the way across. And if you've got, like me, any little ends sticking up, you can just keep whip stitching until you get to a sewn edge. All the way across. And then you have a beautiful finished shoulder seam. And do that on both sides. So now the last thing we have to do before putting in eyelets is closing our back seams. So the easiest way to do this, I've found, because you have a piece of boning in there, is you can take this to the iron and press this seam allowance up. And that weight of that boning will help you get a lovely even turn. So I do my outer fabric first using that boning channel and just the nose of the iron to kind of push the fabric over. Using the iron to keep it flat and pressed, and then pressing it down, I tuck my lining in, and you can see aligning it to the outer fabric. It sounds fiddly, but doing it is quite intuitive. Tucking in my corners and pressing all the way along so that they want to stick together. And then before I sew it, I just like to pop a couple pins in, because you can see it won't stay perfectly flat. And it's a bit annoying to be trying to hold everything in place and sew on the machine. So I just pop a couple little pins right on that overlapping edge. This can be a little fiddly because of the boning, but if you just wiggle the pins around a little bit, there we go. So I do that on both edges, pinning everything closed, and then we can take it over to the machine and just right along that edge. So that way we know we're catching the lining, we're catching the outer, and we just want to stitch right on that edge. All the way down. And now our back edges are closed. So the last thing to do is pop in eyelets, which I've done. Again, I'm not explaining that just because most eyelets come with their own instructions. And then I use ribbon to lace my stays. You can use cord, you can use anything you prefer. So I like to start feeding it through, grab both my ends, and then pull them together so I know I'm getting right in the middle at the bottom of my stays. I'm not going to have one really long bit of ribbon and one really short bit. Then I separate. I start on one side and I always go inside to outside. Then, because I'm doing bunny laces, because this is the easiest for me, at the middle, I'll do one where I go up and over. So instead of crossing, I leave that loop on one side. I'll go up and I'll meet it with my other piece of ribbon so I don't get confused. I leave my little loop. And then we go back to cross lacing. So every other hole, and then right at the top, going front to back, so that when we tie our lacing together, you don't end up with a knot on the outside of your stays. So you'll have that little crisscross right at the very top. And then I've found the best way to tie these is to put the ends of my ribbon together and tie them into a knot this way. And I've just found this means no matter how much pressure you put, no matter how tightly you lace these stays, that knot never comes undone on you. And then you can just go back, loosen up all those ribbons, loosen up the ties so that you can wriggle into the stays, and they're ready to go. That is your completed stays. That is both views. So you can see when they're done, they finish the exact same size. One's not wider, one's not bigger than the other. One has bias, which is this one here, and one does not. So it is entirely aesthetic. It's entirely just, if you want to sew binding, sew binding. If you don't want to sew binding, don't sew binding. Sewing is about doing whatever you want to do, guys. Just enjoy it. So these are the bound, and then we're going into the unbound. I actually really love the way these turned out as well. There's something really clean about this line. And I think they both look great, but they make the exact same shape. So pick the one you like more. We did it! We made a pair of stays! Thank you so much to everyone who's gotten this far in the video, who's watching, commenting, subscribing, YouTube algorithm things. Thank you. Everyone who sent me a DM or left a comment saying that I helped them, you guys make my day. I can't thank you enough. It really, it just, even one person learning something makes me so happy. So I just want to try and share a little bit of some of that 20 years of accumulated knowledge with someone. So if you're watching, if you're subscribing, if you've seen any of my videos or sent me one of those sweet messages that I have gotten, thank you so much. You really make my day. I love you guys. I'm gonna play them like a drum.